So now I'm going to introduce and chair the keynote panel 2. The panels are relating to the collaborative innovation projects that were new to us last year, and we have 3 of them. So today we've got 2 of the panels which relate to the projects. We're really delighted with how the projects have worked out, and this is going to be an ongoing thing that we've been bid for, and you heard about that. The people who were here yesterday from Sam, that there will be a call going out for new collaborative innovation projects. So I am delighted to welcome Julie, Louise and Katy for their presentations regarding the project that they've done this year.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming us and for really kindly funding our project, which is trying to evaluate a psychologically informed teaching intervention around student identities. We're running a multi-site naturalistic controlled trial. So I'll explain what this means. So I'm a psychologist, that's my background. And I've developed from my research, I've developed a tool that academics and teachers can use with their students to support students to develop learner identities in the classroom as opposed to consumer identities. And we've designed a trial to try and evaluate the effectiveness of this intervention on student identities. So I'm Louise Taylor, I'm from Brookes University, and I'm joined by Katy Burgess from Cardiff University and Julie Hulme, obviously you know today. But I also want to recognise the project team as well. Molly and Katy are 2 students, psychology master students, who have been really helpful with the project, as well as Alison, Allan and Fiona, who have all been supported the project, so I want to recognise the team. Okay, so just by way of background information and setting the context. So over the last 20 years or so, we're all probably aware that higher education has become marketised, and this first recognition of students as customers or consumers was in the Deering report in 1997. And this has, over the last kind of 20 years or so, we've seen this increase in environments in which higher education is marketised. So students have become defined as consumers or customers. Higher education institutions have become defined as kind of service providers. And we have increasing importance is placed on things like the National Student Survey, student satisfaction, league tables, competing for students, and much more question about the value of degrees based on money. So this creates some tensions, and in a project with another student, Naomi King, we interviewed some academics to ask them about what they felt about the current situation, the marketisation, and how this impacts students and their experiences in the classroom. So here's some quotes from some of the staff that we interviewed. So one member of staff said, it's a strange irony, by them paying more, we kind of give them more, but actually the outcome is less, because they're kind of, staff are worried about, if you start challenging students, this might create lower satisfaction levels, and if our satisfaction scores are what we're being judged by, then we're kind of encouraging mediocrity, as one member of staff said. The middle quote is really interesting. There are so many controls that stop us improving students. I'd push students far more if I didn't have the cost of the NSS behind me. The minute you start doing it, if there's going to be complaints, you don't want to step out of line and kind of get a whole cohort of dissatisfied students. Some members of staff talk about getting more comments about, well, I'm paying my wages, I'm paying for my degree, and the students seem to sort of focus more on grades rather than the process of learning and challenging themselves. So it creates this marketised environment is definitely creating some tensions. So for example, it's like this distinction between wanting to be challenged versus entertained. What's our role as educators? Are we there to challenge students or keep them satisfied? Is it about developing their skills or kind of serving them a degree? Are they paying for an opportunity, or are they paying for an outcome? So are they paying for being able to have the opportunity to learn and develop their critical and creative thinking, or are they just paying for the piece of paper at the end of it, the qualification, and is that their focus? And again, this is what I've already touched on. Do we engage in safe teaching because that's what might keep students more satisfied, or do we want to really challenge students and risk creating possible dissatisfaction? Some preliminary research that I did, again, led by a student, it was her final year undergraduate project in psychology. We looked at we assessed, measured students' level of kind of consumer identity, and we found that there was a negative correlation between their identity as a consumer and their self-reported academic grades. In other words, the more they identified as a consumer, that was associated with a weaker, slightly lower academic performance. So there's all these kind of issues that marketisation creates in learning and teaching environments. I've seen lots of you here nodding as I've been talking. So when I presented the research that we've done at conferences and within my own institution, staff would always come up to me then and say, okay, this is terrible, what can we do about it? You know, have you got any suggestions? And so I realised after a few years that I needed to do something about this actually practically. I needed to provide something for you to use with your students to raise these issues, to talk about it, and to try and support students' identities as learners as opposed to consumers. So after a couple of years of work, some of it used my parental leave while my son was sleeping to think about this. I developed a toolkit to provide educators with some resources they could use with students in a kind of one-off workshop as part of maybe personal tutoring type sessions or induction activities, or as a psychologist I could use it in my actual teaching as part of teaching material. But I'd so created the resources on a website, housed through Brookes, but also through talking with Advanced HE, they've published it as a toolkit that you can download from the Advanced HE website as well. So yeah, do have a look, do scan the QR code for a quick look at the website while I'm talking. But it's there, brookes.ac.uk/SIIP, and that's for Student Identities and Inclusion Project. So it's got some other resources on there I've developed. Okay, so this is the toolkit of balancing students' identities as learners and consumers. Right, we're going to hand over to Julie, who's going to describe the workshop.
Thank you, Louise. So the way that this runs is actually really easy to deliver. I haven't been involved in the project up to this point. I joined Louise last year when she got the funding for the Collaborative Innovation Project. And the idea is that you invite students to a workshop. In my case, they attended voluntarily. You can embed it into compulsory modules and things like that as well. So it's very flexible, and actually I found out later that one of my colleagues had embedded it in her module. We need to talk to each other more about interview psychology, obviously. But yes, so the idea is that come along to this workshop. I did it as part of PACE Week, which is a sort of extracurricular opportunity for students to engage in things to do with personal development and employability and things like that. So students come along, they start out by completing a questionnaire. And the questionnaire asks them about basically their attitudes to learning and whether they see themselves as consumers. Are they here to purchase an education with expectations of what they'll receive? Or are they here to learn and a sort of intrinsically motivated engagement with content? And then from that they can rate their student type. So they get a score which tells them what kind of student they are. You then take them through.
Julie, go to the next slide and there's some
other
questions.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, here we go. So here's some of the questions. So for example, consumer identity, education is something I receive, not something I create. Learner identity, if I try hard enough, then I will understand the course material. So they're really sort of thinking about how they approach their learning and what their responsibilities are as a learner, or what they see the university as being expected to provide for their field. So then there's a series of PowerPoint slides that you work through that explains to the students some of the research that's been done previously around this, and that actually having consumer identity can be quite harmful in terms of their outcomes. So the more they engage as a consumer and the less they engage as a learner, the more likely they are to not do quite so well. So it ties in with the idea of
You can just describe the types.
yeah, so hold on. I'm sorry. And then they go into a discussion, and as part of the discussion, you start to work with the students to think about, well, what would be a good psychology student? What would be a good business student? What would be a good law student? And so they start to think about their becoming professional identity. We heard yesterday from Harriet about being, belonging and becoming. And the becoming part is what we start to think about here, is how do we develop that identity of becoming a law student and what a law student might be like. So we looked at questions. Afterwards, once they've done the questionnaires, they get to reflect also on the idea of whether or not their learner identity changed or didn't change, and whether or not their consumer identity changed or didn't change. So they do this questionnaire both before the workshop, then they have the workshop reflect on their own identity, and then they do a post-workshop questionnaire with these extra questions about how they feel they might have changed just from taking part in the workshop. Now, it's a 60 to 90 minute workshop. I ran it for 90 minutes, and I actually found I needed the 90 minutes. My students were very keen to discuss. They had lots of insights and ideas about why they might have consumer identities and why they might have learner identities, and we can touch on some of that in the discussion. But there was a real kind of, for me, they were very reflexive about their own experiences of university and what it meant to them, and it really tied in with their identities. So these are the 4 types of students that we might have based on the questionnaire. So they could be a customer, very much investing finances in their degree. They expect to get good grades, that's their entitlement, and they don't have to make a lot of effort. It is your job to make them learn. You will disseminate learning into their brains, and they will be able to walk away with a certificate in their hand. The undecided doesn't really know what they're doing, whether they're a learner or whether they're a consumer, and they probably don't really know why they've chosen the subject that they've chosen. So to some extent, these are the ones who've kind of done their A-levels or their access courses or whatever it is that they've done, and they've drifted in because maybe their parents expected it, maybe their friends were all going to uni, they've not really thought about it too much. The striver is very much focused on their learning, they enjoy learning, they're engaged with their degree, but it is to get a career. I'm going to do a psychology degree, I'm going to be a clinical psychologist, that's what I want. So I'm going to work hard because I want that career at the end of it. So it's very much, it is extrinsically motivated to some extent, but they're working really hard and they are engaged. And then the thinker, and this is the intrinsically motivated student who's curious about their subject, who wants to learn more, who is happy to be challenged and seeks feedback to improve themselves, the model student, the one that we all really want. So, have a think about which students you need. Because in a minute, Louise is going to talk to you about how many students fall into each category. Is that the end of my slides, Louise? Yeah?
So much, thank you. Okay. I don't know if I can go back now. I don't know if you saw that. I'm not good to be honest. Hopefully you blinked and you missed the figures. Right, so who thinks that the majority of students might be customers? Just hands up. Okay, a few of you, so maybe, I don't know, less than a third, less than a quarter. Who thinks the majority of students may be strivers? Oh, a few more of you, maybe, probably the majority of you. Undecided? Oh yeah, still quite a few of you. And who thinks the majority might be thinkers? Oh wow. Okay. So I think the majority of you are kind of split between customers and strivers, which is really interesting. Thank you. Right, I will show you now what they actually are. So the data I'm going to show you is based on a sample of around 700 students. The data was collected about 5 years ago. Students are from all over the country, from all undergraduates at different universities, studying every subject you can imagine. So here are the figures. Now there's obviously caveats to this. These are students who have volunteered to take part in a survey for out their own free will. So the sample of students is obviously probably going through those who are more motivated and engaged in the first place. But nonetheless, we see the majority of those students who took part are thinkers, also a lot of strivers, and very few students who purely had a strong consumer identity and a weak learner identity. So that's not the majority of students. The majority of students have a strong learner identity, so it's the ones on the right-hand side. All those students have a strong learner identity. The strivers also have a strong consumer identity. The thinkers do not have a strong consumer identity as well. So you might kind of think that learner and consumer identities are kind of on a continuum with, you're either a consumer or you're a learner, but actually I think it's more helpful to think of these two identities as operating kind of in parallel, and students can be strong and weak on both, and those interact to create kind of different types of students. So actually, having students who are strivers, I'd say they're also a really positive group because they're engaged, they want to learn, they expect a lot from you, they'll come and see you in your office hours, they come and ask feedback about things. So I think, students with a strong learner identity are, it's obviously really important, and this shows from our sample that most students do have that. So in terms of evaluating the workshop, the workshop's been live for a couple of years now. We've got anecdotal feedback from students about how they, here's some comments, it gives me insight into the way I learn, knowing this may benefit the way I study and approach my work in the future. Fantastic. It's interesting to realise there was a correlation between consumers and poor grades. This has made me reevaluate whether my poor grades are because I expect to be taught everything, rather than forcing myself to go out there and do more. So thank you for that. Okay, that's excellent. And helps you understand yourself better, your motivations, and maybe explain why you're doing well and not doing well. So students who are engaged and who took part in the workshop and gave feedback were obviously really positive about it, and that was excellent. But I wanted to know a bit more. I wanted to actually do more kind of scientific evaluation of the project to find out exactly what is happening to students' identities and measure them scientifically rather than just relying on what students are saying. So this is where I heard about the collaborative project funding last year at this conference, and I applied, and I was so delighted to be funded. So thank you so much for funding the project. And what I was starting to think about was, I'm a teaching-focused academic. I do, as a psychologist, I kind of do education-based research, but it hasn't previously been included in the ref. I've got my sights set high, so I think let's aim high. Let's see if we can do a project that is at least worthy of consideration in the ref. So I kind of went back to basics and thought about what do I need to do to make sure this is, a proper science experiment almost. There's a lot of subtle research is standing in the classroom, it's looking at and evaluating things with our students, but it's not necessarily done with things like a control group. So I want to thank Richard Medios, who's at Nottingham Trent. When I talked to him about the project, you must have a control group, you must have a control group. So a control group is when you have a group of students who you still measure the same things, but you do nothing to them. So they don't take part in the workshop. So the students in our control group, they took part, they filled in the questionnaires for us, so we measured their identities before and after a normal teaching session. So they didn't take part in the workshop. So those are our control groups. We want to see what happens to student identities, even if they don't take part in the workshop. So we've got our control group. We, ideally in science, you do a randomised control trial of everything. So you randomly allocate your participants to receive, drug A or drug B, and you see which ones get better or not. Well, this is in the real life. You can't, in education, necessarily randomly allocate students to receive the workshop or not, because that just isn't realistic. So rather than doing a randomised trial, we're doing a naturalistic controlled trial. So we still have our control group. We have some students in some courses who are in the control group, but we're not randomly allocating. I'm saying, Katy, for example, you're running the control group with some of your students, because that's what was fitted within your schedule at the time. Julie, you were able to kindly run the experimental, the workshop group. So we've got a variety of people involved in the project, and depending on what suits their particular situation, we're either students who are taking part in the workshop or not. The other thing that's really important, and this is being talked about a lot now in science and particularly psychology, my discipline, is that having open science and reproducible science. I'm going to hand over to Katy now, who's going to talk to you about what that is and what we did to make our project fit in with the kind of open science guidelines.
Thanks, Louise. So I'm Katy Burgess. I'm also a psychologist, and I'm really an experimental psychologist, so I'm interested in running experiments in order to understand how our students learn and remember information. And I've been very lucky to work with some people who are kind of at the forefront of the open science movement and learn a lot from them and then bring that to this project. So I'd like to get a kind of sense in the room. Who's heard of open science before? Yeah? Who's heard of the reproducibility crisis? You have. Okay, so I'll start there. So in the social sciences in particular, there's something called a reproducibility crisis. And what this means is that scientific findings that have been published have been impossible to replicate. Okay? And from this is kind of thought to be due to something called p-hacking, where you kind of hack at the data until you get a significant result. Yeah, people do that. And things like hypothesizing after the results are known, so rather than designing your studies to test a specific hypothesis, is looking at that afterwards. And so all of these kind of dodgy practices lead to results that aren't necessarily true. And as scientists, that's what we're trying to find, is the truth, and what works for our students, what works for learning, what works for memory, in my discipline in particular. So, this is really unhelpful that things are getting published that aren't necessarily true. So one of the positive things that's come out of this reproducibility crisis is a movement towards open science. And what open science means is that we're making scientific methods and results accessible to all levels of society, so from amateurs to professionals. This means anyone can go and look at what you've done, how you've handled your data, and so on and so forth. So it makes scientists more accountable and make sure that they're not kind of behind closed doors doing dodgy things with their data to make sure the data fits with what they want to say about it. And one of the best platforms for sharing your methods and how you're doing your research and going about your research is the Open Science Framework. Okay, has anyone heard of the Open Science Framework? Yeah? Anyone used it? Yeah? It's quite intimidating to do it the very first time. As Louise found out in this project, we need some help, what do we do? So it's basically a platform where it's free to use. just go in, sign up. It's osf.io or something. But if you just type Open Science Framework into, there we go. Yes, it is osf.io. You just type it into Google and it will come up. You can upload what's called a pre-registration. And what a pre-registration is you are telling people what you are going to do in your experiment, in your research, and describing exactly what your methods are going to be. So you start off by explaining kind of, an introduction like in a scientific paper. You say what the background is to the research, what's been found so far, and how that has led you to your study. So if you're doing something experimental, that would be your hypotheses. If you're doing something more qualitative, like focus groups or interviews, that would just be, to what you might expect to see in your data. And then you outline your methods, so what your method's going to be, how you're going to measure this, and then finally you talk about how you're going to analyse your data. If you're doing something quantitative, you need to do power analysis, which is also a very fun / terrifying part, where you're kind of assessing how many participants you might need to see any given effect. So in order for us to know an effect is true, we need to have enough participants to see that effect. So that's what we did. We put together a pre-registration where we outlined all the literature so far on consumer and student identities, much of which has been published by Louise herself. And then we hypothesised about what might happen, and we outlined what methods we're going to use with the workshop and the intervention. And then finally, we talked about what our analysis plan is going to be. So what we're going to do with that data, what data we're going to remove, if anything, participants haven't completed the survey, for example, their data's going to be fairly useless. So what we're going to do with that. And then what this means is, when we get the data and analyse the data and everything like that, the publication is going to be a lot easier, because a lot of that's already there. We've already written the introduction, we've already written the methods, and we've kind of touched already on the results, we know what we're doing. So it does make the kind of end product part of that process much easier. And if you want to see our pre-registration, if you scan that QR code if you haven't already, and that will give you an example of what a pre-registration looks like. If you're not used to quantitative methodologies, it might seem quite intimidating, but there's loads and loads of resources on OSF for, if you do qualitative research or anything like that. So if you do a particular type of scholarship, if you do SOTL, it's a really great resource, and it's really nice to be involved in open science and making science accessible and our results accessible to everyone and not behind a paywall. Because we talk a lot about inclusivity of our teaching and our methods, but if people can't access it because it's behind a paywall, that's not really inclusive. So I think that's everything I had on that. I'll pass back to Louise for the findings.
Yeah, so having done a lot of head scratching about trying to predict what we might find from this, and making sure that our predictions were actually grounded in the research and not any preconceived ideas that we might have. So it was a really excellent exercise and a challenging one, but hopefully one that now we're kind of more confident in the science and the process that we're going through. So great news is that over this last semester, we've got around 700 students from across the 5 sites. So all the project partners have implemented the intervention or the control group in their, with one of their courses. Mostly it's psychology students so far, because we're largely a team of psychologists. And one of the key things, though, was that we wanted to be able to compare students' own responses before the workshop and after the workshop. So, because of ethical issues, we can't ask students for their name or identifying information to match up their pre- and post-workshop scores. So, what you often do, what's common practice, is that you ask students to provide a unique code so you can then match up their scores. So this is what we ask students to do, provide a unique code so responses can be matched. And as an example, this is what the ethics committee suggested, that they asked students for some initials, like a person who's close to you, like a close friend or a family member. You can't ask for the student's own initials, obviously, because that's identifying information. So, initials of the person, a memorable 2-digit number, such as the last 2 digits of your phone number, and your favourite city. Now, you would have thought that graduate level students would be able to do that. Only 124 students were able to do that out of the 700 or so who took part. So this is slightly disappointing because we, I don't look at the post question and yes, 700 students have done it, this is amazing. And then when we actually looked at the data, we could only actually match up exactly 124 students. Now, there's various statistical methods you can use. I won't bore you with. In our pre-registration report we put on OSF, we said we're going to use the same students before and after the workshop. Well, this is our first snag because we now don't have the data, so we might have to do some different test that takes into account students that you haven't got exactly the same matching anyway. And we've currently only got a very small control group, and we want to expand that considerably, but this is where we are for analysing the data that I'm going to show you today. So the data today is based on those 124 students who completed the measures correctly before and after the workshop. Again, this is a very narrow section of students who are the ones who have read instructions carefully and been able to remember their unique code. So there's the caveat to these data. Anyway, so as we found in the survey from a few years ago, the majority of students who we've got this data for are thinkers, so they've got a high learner identity and a low consumer identity. About a third of them were strivers, so they had a high learner identity and a high consumer identity, and then very small numbers of just consumers or undecided. So this kind of reflects the data from the survey of 700 students, so maybe they're not that different from students who complete, volunteers who complete surveys. Now, so this is the crux. Did learner identity change? So we do have two methods of looking at this. We've got the mean scores from the questionnaires. We also just had a subjective kind of, do you feel like your identity increased or decreased? But just for simplicity, because of our small numbers, I've just gone with showing you the data for that question. Do you think your learner identity increased? And they could answer on a scale from like 1 to 7. So I basically just grouped them into students who basically said it either decreased, stayed the same, or increased. So in the control group, now this is really interesting. This is why it's so important to have a control group who don't do your intervention or don't do your activity. So what this graph on the left shows is that in the control group, so these are students who complete the questionnaires just before and after a normal teaching session. I admit some of them are my students, and some of them, and there's students from 1 or 2 other lecturers in there as well. But over half the students who just had a normal teaching session, they reported that their learner identity had increased just by virtue of being taught a class, which is really interesting. Great. And slightly under half said, we'll just stay the same. Okay, fine. But this helps us to contextualise the findings that we get from those students who took part in our actual workshop to try and influence identities. So in the actual workshop we had, remember 124 students, 65% of them said that yes, it's increased, around a quarter it stayed the same, and a tiny minority said it decreased. So actually what this is telling us is around 10%, so if you look at the difference between the increase in learner identity in the control group and the workshop group, you've got about the 10% effect of the workshop itself. Remember, this workshop's all about getting students to think about identities, understand their own identity, talk about it, hear about the research on the importance of identities. So it is having an impact, but a small impact. But as I say, having a control group is really important for understanding the effects of the workshop. We also asked students to just explain why do you think it changed or didn't change. So these responses are really informative. So a couple of examples of students who said their learner identity had increased. One said, I learned more about what a learner is and realised it aligned with what I believe I am as a student. Another one said that speaking to other students allowed me to see that we're all passionate about our subject and we can communicate to increase in our passion for the subject. So this is really positive again, it's increasing their learner identity. The students who said that it hadn't changed, they were kind of really saying, well, I'm already a learner, I'm still a learner, it's not changed. It's always been satisfying to learn new things, that's why I wanted to go to university. Or saying that, just one workshop's not going to change my identity. So that was helping us understand what they said. And then again, we looked at the same in terms of did their consumer identity change or not. So we were expecting that from the workshop we hoped that learner identity would increase, consumer identity would decrease. And what we found in the control group was that for a quarter of students, 27%, just answering questions about their consumer identity before and after a normal teaching session increased their consumer identity. So this is probably like a saliency effect. If you're asking students about something, they're going to be thinking about it more and they've brought it to mind, and then they're reporting that, maybe I am a consumer, or they're thinking about it more and answering questions about it for a second time. After a teaching session, it has increased for some of them. 50% is the same, and 23% their consumer identity decreased after just a normal teaching session. So again, this is really important. This just shows that asking students some questions about stuff can impact how they feel, their identities. So our identities are flexible, they change over time and in different contexts they become more or less salient. But nonetheless, we weren't expecting this. And then in the workshop group, again, similarly, we've got around a third of students in each category. So around a third said, well, this has increased my consumer identity, a third said it stayed the same, and a third said it decreased in the workshop condition. So this did leave us a bit puzzled, and it wasn't quite what we were hoping would happen. Is this a good or bad thing? Well, I'm hoping that I'll hear from all of you about your thoughts about this after. But anyway, so we looked at some of the qualitative comments. Why did your consumer identity change or not? So students said things like, well, I think it's shifted, it's made me realise as a consumer I need to make use of all the resources. I think also probably students are a little bit mixed about what elements of their education are kind of being consumed and what makes them more of a learner. Now I know that I'm more of a consumer, I feel like I should ensure this degree sets me up for a job, and now I'm looking into job options and topics that interest me. So I feel like for that student, it's actually been it's kind of given them a bit of extra motivation to make sure they are getting the best from their degree, which I don't think that's not a bad thing. I've been made more aware of this, the fact that I'm paying, and it's in a sense a service. Because discussing it, that's potentially going to have that impact. Another student said, we discussed views of entitlement and ownership, which did make me think more about what the university owes me in terms of the contracts and our expectations. Mainly because the university has held up their end of the bargain. So we kind of had this, there's this really kind of paradox. So the environment is marketised. Higher education institutions are competing for students. It's all about what's making our students satisfied, that's really important. We know that some students have a high consumer identity. How can we address that? We can talk about it, we can help them measure it, reflect on it. But the opposite side of that is that it seems that for some students for whom that's not a salient part, it then raises this issue and makes them think about it more. Another way to look at the figures are to look at in the post-workshop group. So although we've got slightly higher levels of consumer identity in the post-workshop group, if we look at it again by categories of students, we don't actually see an increase in the number of students who are falling into any of the kind of high consumer categories. So within that 124 students who took part in the workshop and we had their scores before and after, actually we've still got the majority of students being thinkers. So although their consumer identity scores might increase somewhat, I don't think they're necessarily increasing enough to put more students into the customer category. But again, I'm hoping that we're going to have 700 students and being able to look at the data much more robustly, but we've got small sample sizes. But this is indicative of the fact that, alright, it might be getting students to reflect on their consumer identity, it might be increasing it, but I don't think we're necessarily, the workshop isn't impacting the type that the student comes out as. It's still promoting students as thinkers. But more data will tell. The other thing I think is important to look at will be, most students already have a high learner identity. So if you're looking at increasing learner identity, those students who have already got strong learner identities, there's not very far for them to go. They're already at the ceiling, so the workshop's not going to have much impact if they're already high learners. So what I want to do when we've got more data is look specifically at that small group of students who are customers, or the small group that are strivers, and see what's happening to them, because I think those are the more interesting students to hone in on, but we need more numbers before we can do that. So before I hand over to you for discussion and comments and questions, I just wanted you to hear from two of our students who aren't here, but nonetheless have been really helpful in working on this project. This is Molly, Katy's student from Cardiff, and this is just what she said about her experience with the project. So working on a project about student identities as a student myself was very insightful to my own experiences of marketised education. It was challenging working with such a big data set. Our initial Excel sheet did have thousands of rows of data points, and that was a bit scary for her, but she said it was a great experience and made me realise that large samples aren't as scary as they appear. She says, I mostly learnt that consumer attitudes towards university are very damaging, although in an ideal world, HEIs would be much less marketised. The role an individual's beliefs and attitudes have towards their learning is so important, and student identities are such a powerful tool for students to take control of their own learning. So that's her experience, and then I want you to hear from Katy as well, who's also a student at Cardiff. She says that exploring how identity influences our education experiences was fascinating, and one of the main challenges was navigating the complexities of data analysis, and especially interpreting unexpected findings. The project served as a profound learning experience, not only in understanding the complexities of student identity, but also in honing my research skills. I also learned how to process and critically analyse the data. And overall, it deepened my understanding of research methodologies, data analysis techniques, and the importance of critical thinking in academic inquiry. Understanding how interventions can enhance academic outcomes and foster a deeper appreciation for education was particularly enlightening. So it was really nice to hear that from both of those students, and it had a real impact on their learning. So I wanted you to hear from our two students involved in the project. Okay, so I thought I'd do a quick next steps, and then I want to hear from you about your thoughts and about the data. We want to look at it, as I said, by student type, but we don't have the numbers yet. We also need a bigger control group as well, and really, please contact me about taking part. So we're looking for project partners, people who are interested and think that this might be able to be used in your institutions with your students. Please get in touch. Now we do have a exciting Padlet inspired by Julie's use of the Padlet yesterday. On the Padlet, you can leave your email address if you would like to hear more about taking part. I'm not going to hold you to taking part just by putting your email address in there, but if you want to discuss whether you might be able to take part, please put your email address on the Padlet. And then also, if you've got any thoughts, you can also add these to the Padlet in terms of why do you think consumer identity increased? Does this matter? Is it a problem? And so, I'd really like to hear from you. So if you have any questions, comments, please. How long have we got left? 5 minutes, okay. Over to you, thank you.
Okay, we've got questions already. Harriet, bring the microphone to you.
Thank you, Louise. That was really interesting. In previous work we carried out at Portsmouth, and then I did a QAA funded project. We had found, so I'm interested to see what groups you're going to look at in the data. We had found that students from certain ethnic backgrounds had differing expectations, and I wondered whether it was by ethnic background, whether you had collected that, and whether they had different mindsets. Some of the work that's been carried out at Portsmouth was about growth mindsets and their expectations of learning.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so as part of the questionnaire we have got data, demographic data. We've also included widening participation students to see if questions to try and ascertain that as well. So I'm just publishing a paper on widening participation students as well, who might have quite a different approach. You know, they're, for many reasons, they might have a different attitude. So yeah, it's definitely something we can look at if we have a slightly bigger data set, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Just to reflect on that as well, some of my students actually said that they thought that having a pure learner identity, so being the thinker, was a privileged position, that because their finances were restricted and constrained, they had to think very carefully about value for money, and that pushed them to a consumer attitude. Whereas, yes, they could still be learners, and it's why the two don't. There's not a tension. We think there's a tension. There isn't a tension. They can be consumers and learners, and both at the same time. And I also had an autistic student who was really sort of interested in this idea, but was again very clear that he was both. Yes, it was interesting. Fran?
Interesting. So my question is similar. I was quite surprised that so many hands went up saying strivers and thinkers, and I was like, yeah, consumers. And I wonder whether there's discipline differences. So if you're studying primary science, medical science, biochemistry, those sorts of very clear career path degrees, whether the interest in the subject matter and the need for my future is more relevant than science and psychology. And yes, it's got to do with big career goals, but it's a very generic, very broad brush graduate degree, whether there's differences in disciplines, if that was the case. Or even different university types as well.
Yeah, in previous studies, we've looked at discipline, like just very broad distinction between STEM and non-STEM, and not really, we didn't find that, not a big difference. So, but instinctively, you would think there was. So it's something that I'm always checking, looking out for.
And it might be interesting to look at the vocational versus non-vocational degrees as well, based on Fran's thinking there. Steve, you're next, but I'm coming over here first, and then over there over time.
Hi, I'm Gemma from the University of Bradford. I'm interested in whether you've looked at this longitudinally, because I've done some work on professional identity of pharmacists, which is who we teach, and they do change as you go, which you hope as they get nearer to graduating. But I think we've also seen in our students that at the beginning, if we use team-based learning, they're very much like, we want you to teach us. And then by the end, they're like, oh yeah, now we know why you do it like that. But it does, I think it would change in our students as you go through the years. So I'm interested if you've done anything on that.
Yeah, I think identity changes are quite small and subtle. In the previous research we've done, we've had students from across all years and a roughly kind of even split, and we haven't found any difference. But again, we thought that there would be a difference between first and third years because of where they are from what you just articulated. But it wasn't. We didn't find any real world big enough difference to be notable.
I'm looking at our chair and it's telling me that we are out of time and we're squeezing more coffee time. So I'm really sorry for those of you who had further questions, but I do know that Louise is here for a little while longer, and Katy and myself are around, so please come and ask us questions. Go find coffee, though.